Aston Martin just spent millions building what was supposed to be a championship car. They partnered with Honda. They brought in Adrian Newey. They promised a new era. And after 3 days in Bahrain, the car was 4 seconds off the pace. 4 seconds. That is not a small deficit. That is the difference between fighting for a title and being eliminated in the first qualifying session. But that number is not even the most alarming part. The engine was shutting down before the end of the straights. The bodywork had to be cut open in the garage, and the team completed barely half the laps of their direct rivals. Something is fundamentally wrong. And what Lance Stroll revealed might have exposed a much deeper structural problem inside Aston Martin. Stay until the end, because the real issue is not just performance. It is whether this project is already in crisis before the season even begins. Subscribe now, because this story is bigger than anyone expected. The collapse did not begin on day 3. It started within the first hours of running. When the AMR26 rolled out of the garage, expectations were enormous. Newey's first full concept. Honda's return as a works partner. A factory built to fight for championships. Everything pointed toward progress. But almost immediately, engineers began seeing irregular data on the pit wall screens. Energy deployment spikes. Temperature curves rising faster than predicted. Battery recovery inconsistent. At first, it looked like calibration. A software mapping issue. But it wasn't. Because every time the car went into a proper push lap, the numbers became unstable again. Here's where it gets critical. The new 2026 hybrid systems generate significantly more electrical load than the previous generation. More harvesting, more deployment, more heat, and heat is the silent killer in Formula One. The Honda unit was not just running warm. It was running beyond its safe operating window. That forced the engineers into immediate damage control. They reduced power modes. They shortened runs. They constantly monitored for critical thresholds. But the deeper problem was not the engine alone. It was the packaging philosophy surrounding it. Adrian Newey designed an ultra-aggressive rear end. Extremely tight side pods. Minimal cooling inlets. Aerodynamically beautiful. Thermally unforgiving. That concept only works if the power unit behaves perfectly. And in Bahrain's desert heat, perfection did not exist. By the end of the first day, the team already knew they were not executing their planned program. They were reacting. And in Formula One, the moment you start reacting instead of executing, you are already behind. But that was just the surface issue. Because what happened on day 2 confirmed this was not a small calibration error. It was something much bigger. Day 2 was supposed to be recovery. Instead, it became confirmation. Because just a few hours into the session, the decision was made. The entire power unit had to come out. Not a small component. Not a sensor. The full unit. That is not precaution. That is alarm. And when you remove a full power unit during testing, you lose something far more valuable than track time. You lose correlation. Every aerodynamic model. Every cooling simulation. Every virtual prediction. All of it suddenly becomes questionable. Because if the temperatures in real life do not match the simulator, then the simulator is lying. And if the simulator is wrong, everything built on it becomes unstable. This is where the situation quietly turned dangerous. While mechanics worked in the garage, the engineers began lowering engine modes even further. Revolutions capped. Energy deployment softened. Aggressive mapping disabled. The car was no longer being tested at full potential. It was being protected. And that creates a hidden illusion. Lap times look bad, yes. But what looks worse is the behavior. Because even in conservative modes, the clipping remained. The car was still running out of electrical energy before the braking zones. Still fading at the end of the straight. Which tells you something critical. This was not about pushing too hard. It was happening inside safe parameters. Now think about what that means. If the system cannot sustain deployment in restricted mode, how will it survive full race conditions? Higher fuel loads. Dirty air. Longer stints. The margin disappears. And here is the detail that most people missed. Because the cooling problem forced Aston Martin to open the bodywork, they unintentionally altered the airflow structure around the rear of the car. More drag. Less stability. Different balance under braking. That may explain the snapping Stroll reported into slower corners. And that connects the engine issue directly to handling instability. This is no longer two separate problems. It is one interconnected system failure. Power unit. Cooling architecture. Aerodynamic balance. All influencing each other. And while the public saw slow lap times, inside the garage they were facing a far more uncomfortable possibility. What if the chassis is simply too tight for this Honda concept? What if the packaging limit has already been reached? Because if that is true, There is no overnight fix. There is only redesign. And redesign in Formula One does not take days. It takes months. By the end of day 2, the atmosphere had changed. Not panic, but urgency. The kind of silence where people stop talking about lap times and start asking structural questions. And day 3 would not bring relief. It would expose something even more revealing. By day 3, the objective had changed completely. They were no longer chasing performance. They were chasing stability. Fernando Alonso stepped into the car that morning with a very specific mission. Not to set headlines. Not to simulate qualifying. To stress test survival. 55 laps. On paper, that sounds productive. But look at the lap time. More than 4 seconds off the front. And here is what matters. Those laps were not about speed. They were about asking one simple question. Will it finish a race distance without shutting down? That is not where a supposed title contender should be 3 days before the season begins. And Alonso knew it. His radio messages were controlled, measured, but his body language told a different story. Gloves thrown onto the cockpit, long meetings with Honda engineers, extended debriefs behind closed doors. He was not searching for balance tweaks. He was searching for trust. Because a driver cannot attack if he does not trust that the power will be there at the end of the straight. And this brings us back to the clipping issue. Telemetry suggested the electrical deployment faded roughly 200 meters before heavy braking zones. Now visualize that. You exit the final corner. Full throttle. Energy deployment active. Then suddenly, it tapers off. The acceleration curve flattens. The car behind you does not flatten. Overtake. That vulnerability changes race strategy completely. You cannot defend. You cannot attack. You cannot even calculate your battery usage accurately. And this is the hidden consequence most people are not discussing. Because the team completed just over 200 laps across 3 days, they have almost no reliable long-run degradation data. No full race simulations in competitive engine modes. No clear understanding of how the battery behaves over extended stints. They are heading into the first Grand Prix strategically blind. And in modern Formula One, data is everything. Without it, even a fast car becomes unpredictable. Now imagine an unstable car with limited data. That is not just a performance issue. It is operational risk. Meanwhile, rivals completed nearly double the mileage, which means their correlation models are solid. Their tire curves are mapped. Their energy deployment refined. Aston Martin, in contrast, is still validating whether the core architecture works. And here is the uncomfortable question emerging inside the paddock. If the chassis is fundamentally too tight for the Honda cooling demands, how do you fix that without redesigning major structural elements? You can open cooling louvres. You can adjust mapping. You can sacrifice aerodynamic efficiency. But at some point, physics wins. If airflow cannot reach the radiators efficiently, no software update will solve it. And that possibility is what transforms this from a bad test into a potential season-defining crisis. Because this project was built around long-term integration, factory, engine partnership, technical leadership. If the foundation is compromised, every layer above it becomes unstable. And that is why Lance Stroll's comment about 4 seconds was not just frustration. It was exposure. He revealed the scale of the gap. But the real story is not the stopwatch. It is whether Aston Martin miscalculated the balance between aerodynamic aggression and thermal reality. And if that miscalculation is structural, the consequences will not disappear after one update package. They will follow them into every hot race, every high-load straight, every moment when maximum deployment is required. The Bahrain test did not just show a slow car. It exposed a system under stress. And the season has not even started yet. Now we reach the most dangerous layer of this situation. Because performance problems can be fixed, reliability issues can be solved. But structural miscalculations, those are different. Inside the Aston Martin garage, there is a silent question nobody wants to say out loud. Did they push the concept too far? Adrian Newey is famous for extreme philosophy, tight packaging, radical airflow concepts, minimal drag, maximum efficiency. When it works, it dominates. But when it does not, the recovery window is very small. The AMR26 was designed around precision. The side pods are narrow. The engine cover is aggressively sculpted. The rear packaging is compact to an almost uncomfortable level. That is beautiful on a design screen. But Bahrain is not a design screen. It is heat. It is sustained load. It is brutal stress for hybrid systems. And what we saw suggests the cooling margins were calculated too tightly. In Formula One, margins matter. If you design with zero tolerance, you must execute perfectly. But Honda's new generation hybrid system is more demanding than previous years. More electrical harvesting, more battery deployment, more thermal output. That means the engine is not just a power source. It is a heat generator of enormous scale. And here is the uncomfortable intersection. If the chassis airflow cannot evacuate that heat efficiently, the power unit must be detuned. If the power unit is detuned, straight line speed collapses. If straight line speed collapses, you compensate with downforce. But they cannot run maximum downforce because they had to open the bodywork, which increases drag. And suddenly, the entire concept starts fighting itself. That is the definition of a compromised platform. And here is why this matters beyond Bahrain. The first race is hot. Several early season races are hot. If the car already struggles in pre-season testing conditions, what happens in race traffic? Dirty air reduces cooling efficiency even further. Following, another car raises internal temperatures. Longer stints increase battery stress. The environment becomes even harsher. So this is not just about being slow. It is about vulnerability. Because if the system overheats mid-race, you are not fighting for points. You are parking the car. And that would destroy momentum instantly. Now add another layer. Team morale. When a project launches with ambition and immediately hits reliability walls, confidence fractures. You could already sense tension in Bahrain. Engineers speaking quietly. Long meetings. Careful media language. Mic cracks shifted tone dramatically. From title ambitions to solving basic issues. That is not a small adjustment. That is psychological recalibration. And morale in Formula One spreads fast. If drivers lose trust in deployment. If engineers doubt simulation data. If departments begin questioning each other's calculations. Performance drops even before lap time shows it. But here is the final layer that makes this even more intense. Because if this integration problem is fundamental, they face a brutal choice. Do they compromise the aerodynamic concept to protect reliability? Or do they redesign major structural elements mid-season? Both options cost time. Both options cost points. And in a regulation cycle where rivals are already optimized, losing the first phase of development can define the entire year. This was supposed to be the season Aston Martin announced itself as a true contender. Instead, after 3 days, they are fighting physics. And the real fear inside that garage is not the 4-second deficit. It is the possibility that the AMR26 is brilliant in theory, but incompatible in reality. And if that turns out to be true, Bahrain will not be remembered as a bad test. It will be remembered as the moment the warning signs were impossible to ignore.